Mangino. Welcome to the Mangino Talks podcast. We talk about everything that matters to Pittsburgh, from current events to Pittsburgh history, social issues to sports, politics to practical day-to-day life. And today, it's about the First Amendment, free speech, and whether or not the University of Pittsburgh violated the free speech rights of a student organization, a conservative student organization. It's all about this debate that was held back in April. You may have read the stories in the Post-Gazette and the Tribune Review. In fact, in my comment section, in the show notes section of this podcast, you will find links to both of those stories and some excerpts as well. But going back to this debate that took place in April, there was a lot of concern, a lot of angst about this even taking place. In fact, I remember talking about this when I was still on KDKA back in March in anticipation that it was going to come, that 11,000 people were signing a petition in order to keep this debate from even occurring. The debate was about the issue of transgender rights. In fact, it was titled, "Should Transgenderism Be Regulated by Law?" It was between a conservative commentator from the Daily Wire, Michael Knowles, and a libertarian journalist, Brad Polumbo, who also defines himself as being gay. And at the time, when all of this angst was going on prior to the event, my argument was that instead of trying to stifle speech, because ultimately in stifling speech, you don't change anybody's mind. All you do is have them speak someplace else. That's all that happens. What would have been much more productive, instead of all of the protests, the 11,000 signatures on an effort to try to keep the university from honoring the First Amendment rights of this group, would have been to go into the debate and be in the audience and then hear the discussion, the arguments that are being made. What is it that Michael Knowles is saying? How can you then counter what Michael Knowles says to overcome what he is projecting and make your own case in order to change hearts and minds of those that can be changed? The reality is that you're never going to change everyone. It's just not going to happen. It doesn't make a difference if you shout louder. It doesn't make a difference if you throw incendiary devices at people like what happened at this event. Does it matter if you block off hospitals in your protest and don't care if people die, like some of these protesters, which is another interesting angle we'll get to coming up in a little bit. I mean, we can fight an entire civil war over the issue of hate and racism. Did it eliminate that racism? You ultimately have to win people over, and it doesn't come from stifling. It doesn't come from being the loudest, the most obnoxious, the most violent. Might doesn't make right. The reason why this is making news right now is because there was a letter that was sent to the University of Pittsburgh. They were outraged that the University of Pittsburgh charged this student group. Initially, it was going to be $2,000 for security force. They then went to $16,000. It ultimately came to over $18,000, and they want the bill paid as of about a week ago. They were insisting it be paid. They then countered with representation from the Alliance Defending Freedom that they are proposing the possibility of a lawsuit against the university, saying that the university violated their First Amendment rights. Well, how did they do that if they had the debate, right? Well, one, they say that they violated those rights by ending the debate early. It wasn't able to go through the entire function of the contract agreement that took place. Why? Because of the protesters outside. The protesters that threw an incendiary device inside the debate room. The protesters that were blocking hospitals with no regard for life whatsoever. And so what did security forces do? They decided, well, you know what? We have to shut this event down. We have to keep it from going any further. Not because of the two debaters and what they did, not because of the 250 people that were in attendance, that were peacefully watching this debate take place, not because of anything the organizers did, but because of the violence and the threat of violence from those without. They also say that obviously, not only the stopping of the debate moving forward and going to its completion in that event, the severe charges that would stifle future free speech just because there would be a group that would be willing to threaten violence because somebody dare speak their mind, right? And on top of all of that, the university decided that they're going to charge the $18,000, and guess what they did during the debate, during that event? Held absolutely no one accountable. I'm reading the story in the Post-Gazette, and they cite that 3 police officers were evaluated by medics during the protest. That means officers were harmed by the protesters, right? Because of what the protesters were doing outside, not because of what the event was doing inside. Pitt Chancellor Patrick Gallagher called the violence at the protest an absolutely unacceptable outcome. However, the Alliance Defending Freedom thinks that that outcome was a reasonable conclusion based upon what Pitt had said about the organization and the event in the first place. They also go on to say by Mr. Gallagher, once again, Pitt Chancellor Patrick Gallagher, freedom of speech does not mean you get to throw explosive devices at anyone, including responding police officers. It does not mean you get to disrupt and light fires and close roads and deter patients from hospitals and all the other nonsense that we saw on Tuesday night. One of the most important phrases in this story, no arrests were made. Think about that one for a second. These pro-transgender protesters were willing to be violent to the point to where they harmed police officers and no one was arrested. They threw an incendiary device at a police officer. Inside the room where the debate was being held, no arrests were made. They were blocking hospitals and no arrests were made. So somebody explain to me why the university is justifiably charging this organization for $18,000 in security measures that obviously the university didn't provide. And the statement that was given by Patrick Gallagher is nothing more than mere lip service. Because if it really is unacceptable, why didn't you have your security forces arrested? Who gave the directive to the police officers to not arrest anyone? So does that now mean that those within certain groups can then engage in criminal activity and then have to worry about being punished by the law? Is that what that means? Is that the message that we're trying to send? Listen, I'm all about equal. I'm all about equity. But there's nothing equal in this scenario. There's nothing equitable about this. The University of Pittsburgh, in my opinion, took the side of the protesters against those that had the constitutional right to peaceably come and discuss an issue, regardless of the issue. Let's flip this around if we could. Let's say that the event that was going on inside was a Black Lives Matter event, or it was a gay pride event. And then the people on the outside are protesting, and they're getting loud. They're getting obnoxious. They're doing things that bring physical harm to police officers, right? Threatening the lives of others and their inability to make access to a hospital. And then all of a sudden, security forces come in and say, oh, listen, this Black Lives Matter event, it has to close down. We can't continue. This pride event, it has to end. And oh, by the way, all those individuals that brought about the end of your event, that committed those violent acts, we're not going to bother charging any of them for their criminality. Not a one. Can you imagine how that would go over? All I'm suggesting is that what is good for one side is good for the other. that if you're going to truly talk about equality and equity, equal justice under the law, doesn't it require that even though you may have a level of compassion to a particular group, that the justice is blind? That you're not going to be arresting people who are protesting this event because they are pro-transgender. You're arresting them because they committed criminal acts, and no one should be above the law. Isn't that something that we hear consistently from the left? And we hear it a lot because of a national figure we all know, right? No one should be above the law. No group should be above the law either. No one should be able to engage in criminality and not have to be concerned about the possible repercussions. There's an interesting companion story to this. Did you hear the story of Mr. Atkins, Damon Atkins, out in Reading? There was a gay pride ceremony at Town Hall, raised the flag, and he came across it, and he decided in that moment from across the street to start preaching. And a police officer decided that that preaching was disturbing the peace, that he was worthy of being arrested. The police officer goes over to Mr. Atkins and says, "Let them have their day. Respect it." And Mr. Atkins responds, "You know who's cheering for us? The people that are in hell. So you do you, and I'm going to do me. This is public property." So the people in hell, he says, were encouraging him to preach repentance, which is consistent with the gospel story where a rich man and Lazarus, they both die. Lazarus is in Abraham's bosom. Rich man is in hell. And the man in hell asks Abraham, "Can Lazarus go and warn his brothers?" Interesting point to be made. Ultimately, the man was arrested, charged with disorderly conduct, and all he was shouting Bible verse. And I can hear a lot of people who are pro-LGBTQ+ right now saying, "Oh yeah, he's disturbing our event. He should have gone to jail." How many of you also believe that the people that were protesting, disturbing a lawful assembly event at Pitt that endangered the lives of people inside that event room, police officers that were harmed, and people that were kept from going to the hospital? Do you think all of those individuals? Do you? And if you don't, why not? Is it a situation to where, well, as long as my side does it, it's okay. If their side does it, it's wrong. How does that make you any better than their side? It doesn't. In no way. This issue of free speech, I think maybe we need a lesson in it too. In realizing that free speech isn't about or granting the ability of individuals to say the things that you want to hear, but granting the ability to those that say the things that are most bothersome. You don't like it. That's why you need free speech rights. The First Amendment, I mean, if everybody was okay with what was being said, why would you need a First Amendment? You don't. You need a First Amendment to protect the speech of what the majority says they reject, so that that individual can speak their mind in freedom. Because think about this. And then even to this, actually it's a situation where it exists now. As a minority group, don't you want the ability to be able to speak your mind, even though the majority would think counter to what your position may be? Right? So why shouldn't everybody else be afforded that? I don't know. We've gotten to a point in this country, and maybe it's not something that's completely brand new. Maybe it's something that's been going on for forever. But we want to use the system to our advantage and then use that same system to be able to oppress others. And it doesn't make a difference. Those who have more influence, more acceptability, more power seem to consistently want to use that against other people. And we have an example of it here. Back to the event of April 18th and its aftermath, the Alliance Defending Freedom alleged that Pitt incited violence, disruption, and censorship when the university officials referred to Mr. Knowles, and that is Michael Knowles of Daily Wire, and his speech as toxic, hurtful, and hate-filled rhetoric. And they're suggesting that Pitt, instead of trying to tamp things down, helped to fan the flame by parroting back what people who were opposed to him were already thinking. They then took that as a license. Pitt is on our side. They stand with us. And even though Mr. Gallagher gave wonderful words when it was all over, the actions of university officers clearly demonstrated that they were on the side of the protesters as well. From the Alliance Defending Freedom Senior Counsel, Philip Seckler. It's bad enough that the University of Pittsburgh charged ISI and college Republicans an outrageous and unconstitutional security fee simply out of fear about how others might react to a particular viewpoint. But it's worse that the university also encouraged students to disrupt the event and shut it down. This is exactly the type of suppression the First Amendment forbids. Now, Pitt, distancing itself from Mr. Knowles' views, also stressed its obligation to the First Amendment. Officials told students that peaceful protest was allowed but could not interfere with the event. Let me ask you this. That real famous person that I was talking about earlier, that we don't want to see be above the law, there are things that he has said over the years that his opposition has made very clear that they believe to be dog whistle, not actually saying anything in and of itself bad, but those who heard, they got the message, right? Doesn't that apply here to Pitt? When Pitt says of Mr. Knowles that his rhetoric and his speech is toxic, hurtful, and hate-filled rhetoric, doesn't that give the wink nod that, you know what, we're on your side? And then they come out clearly and say, okay, peaceful protest must be allowed. But then when the first person steps over the line and throws that incendiary device inside and nothing's done, the clear message was sent, do as you will. We're not going to stop you. And if you get loud enough and boisterous enough, we'll go ahead and shut this thing down. That's what they did. That's what happened. The day of the debate, protesters occupied the block outside of O'Hara Student Center. Protesters chanted loudly. Some started fires in the streets. One protester burned an effigy of Mr. Knowles. Emergency radio dispatches that night indicated that entrances to Oakland Hospital were blocked by the protest, as we've talked about earlier. Several minutes before the debate began, a loud explosive sound was heard from the debate room. Pitt officials later said protesters had thrown an incendiary device in the direction of officers. And once again, 3 officers hurt, no arrests were made. So, I've made it a point in this show in wanting to not just point out problems, but to try to focus on some solutions. And one of them is that if you want tolerated, tolerate. If you want accepted, accept. If you want the right and the ability to peacefully protest, then when somebody is doing something opposing you, honor that. I'm not saying don't protest, but peacefully protest. If you don't want anybody committing violent acts against you because of who you are and what you stand for and what you say, don't do it to others. And then try to stand on some kind of moral high ground that you're taking the better position and that your criminal acts are justified. There needs to be a proper examination of oneself individually and the group that you decide to be associated with. And are you truly upholding the standards that you claim to have? Thank you for listening to the Mangino Talks podcast. New episodes drop Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. For more on me and the show, be sure to visit manginotalks.com. Follow me on your favorite social media platform by using @ManginoTalks, or you can just Google Mangino Talks. And once you find me, please like, follow, subscribe, and share the pages with your friends and your family. And thanks again for listening to the Mangino Talks podcast.